Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, friends near and far. Welcome to Weiser Center for Emerging Democracy's third panel of the Flashpoint series, today on Hong Kong, co-sponsored by the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. If you missed our previous event on WCED's YouTube channel, you can find the recordings of the other two Flashpoint panels on Belarus and Lebanon, and the panel on democratic survival in the Muslim world. In the past few years, we have watched Hong Kong become an epicenter of contentions. When handed over from British to Chinese rule in 1997, Hong Kong's special autonomous status was guaranteed by the principle of one country, two systems for 50 years. Since then, this status has been eroded. We have seen the umbrella movement in 2014, large-scale protests against the Extradition Bill and the national security law in 2019 and 2020. Often the news reports create more questions than provide answers. Luckily, today we have a panel of experts to share the observations and insights on the judicial, political, and social developments in Hong Kong. My name is Jundai Liu. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. I'll briefly introduce today's speakers. First, Nicholas Hausen is a professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School. Professor Hausen writes and lectures widely on Chinese law topics, focusing on Chinese corporate law and securities regulation, the Chinese capital markets, Chinese legal history, and development of constitutionalism in Greater China. Professor Hausen has been a consultant to the Ford Foundation, the UN Development Program, the Asian Development Bank, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and the Chinese legislature and various PRC government ministries and administrative departments in connection with the drafting of PRC statutes and regulations. In addition to Michigan law, he has visited and taught at the Berkeley, Columbia, Cornell, and Harvard Law Schools. Second, Wai-Hei Samson Yun, who is joining us from Hong Kong, is assistant professor at the Department of Government and International Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University. He studies contentious politics, civil society, and food politics, with a particular focus on the Greater China region. He has published articles in mobilization, political studies, communist and post-communist studies, Journal of Contemporary China, China Information, Modern China, among many others. He's a co-editor of an Epoch of Social Movements, published by the Chinese University Press in 2018. Third, Mary Gallagher is a professor of political science at the University of Michigan, where she is also the director of the International Institute. Professor Gallagher is an expert in Chinese politics, law and society, and labor politics. Her most recent book is Authoritarian Legality in China, Law, Workers, and the State, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. She is a member of the National Committee on US-China Relations and has consulted for the World Bank, the US State Department, and Department of Labor, and many other NGOs and international organizations. A fourth speaker is Xiaohong Xu, assistant professor of sociology at University of Michigan. His research lies in the intersection of comparative historical sociology, cultural sociology, and the political economy. He has investigated and published on patterns of contention in revolutionary China, as well as state formation in early modern Europe. He's currently completing a book manuscript entitled The Great Separation, the Chinese Cultural Revolution and the Political Origins of Our Time. Meanwhile, he's beginning a new project on tech innovation and class formation in contemporary China. During the talks, you can raise questions at any time in the Q&A section, and we will answer questions after individual presentations. Without further ado, let's get started. Our first speaker is Professor Nicholas Hausen. Nico, please.
Thank you, Jundai. I hope everyone can hear me. If the co-panelists can stick up their thumb, that's great. I want to thank Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies and the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies for convening this meeting with some real experts, aside from not me, but the others who will speak to you in a moment, about a topic which is extremely important. My job is to do what lawyers always do, which is to go through the boring stuff and set up some institutional and political history before we get to the really interesting stuff anon. Now, I have to disclose that, I'm going to put my timer on, wait. I have to disclose that some of this is deeply personal to me, including the kind of long vision I have, because I've been involved with Hong Kong and with a number of the events that I'm going to talk about, including the patent electoral reforms before the handover, the right of abode cases right after the handover, the massive resistance by intellectuals, lawyers, and of course the people of Hong Kong against the Article 23 national security legislation in 2003. So the picture I'm going to give you is in some sense informed by what I've seen and what I've experienced in Hong Kong, which is a place that my grandfather moved to or fled to from Shanghai in 1948, where he was one of really the builders of modern Hong Kong, or certainly post-World War II Hong Kong. So as I said, what I'm going to do is provide a kind of an introduction to what's happened over maybe the last 30 years. And already Jun Dai has, invoked the phrase that we always use when we think about Hong Kong, 一国两制, one country, two systems. We often also hear 50年不变, right? 50 years without change. I want to offer another Chinese idiom which has nothing whatsoever to do with Hong Kong and post-1997 Hong Kong, but helps me structure my remarks. And it's an idiom that we have from Chairman Mao, which dates back to the Great Leap Forward, which is 两条腿走路, walking on two legs. What does that refer to for me? Well, it refers to the two tracks of development that I want to trace over the last 20 or 30 years. And those two paths are often conflated or mixed up in the political and legal rhetoric that is applied to Hong Kong. But I want you to think of them separately, at least in terms of institutional and political design. And then, as you'll see in a moment, I want to make a case for how they become kind of fatally intertwined. So what are those 两条腿? What are those two legs that I'm talking about? Well, one is a process of democratization, specifically the democratization or the democratic selection or election of two key offices in the Hong Kong government. One, the executive branch, for lack of another word, which is the chief executive and the executive branch administrators. And then, of course, the legislature in Hong Kong, which goes by the name of the LegCo. And that's one leg, that's one track that I want to follow. The other is something which I said is often conflated with democratization, but is a separate issue which I put under the terrible over-accommodating term of rule of law. And let me explain what I'm selling, and perhaps I'll just do this by way of introduction without getting into the details. I have a thesis that upon the handover, there were two, as I say, tracks upon which Hong Kong departed. One I want to call the rule of law track. And that was supposed to proceed in accordance with the original design, not only of the Joint Declaration, but in the Basic Law. And the idea was to have autonomous or semi-autonomous courts of law, which were able to protect the rights of the citizens of Hong Kong pursuant to a Bill of Rights, which was entrenched inside the Basic Law as a kind of mini constitution. And there are other aspects, but the idea was that somehow Hong Kong would be an island of the rule of law, which is the ability to resist the overwhelming power of the autocrat or whoever is in the shoes of the autocrat. Now, my thesis is that that went pretty well, including through the Article 23, or the first Article 23 chaos and resistance, in that the Hong Kong government offered up a bill which was supposed to respond to the command in the Basic Law to draft and implement national security legislation. And the people of Hong Kong, intellectuals, lawyers, etc., rose up and said, we have a few doubts about the courts. We certainly have doubts about an executive branch, which is not accountable. We certainly have even bigger doubts about a LegCo, which can't draft substantive law that is accountable to the people who are governed, and therefore we will resist it. And this is really the first incident whereby the people of Hong Kong rose up, in my mind, on a rule of law agenda, right? They said, we understand what this legislation is and we don't want it. And indeed, it was defeated in 2003. The second thing you saw, which we're going to hear more about later tonight, of course, is the Rendition Ordinance, which was ill-advisedly, to say the least, introduced by the Hong Kong executive in 2019, leading to our current circumstance. And I would say that the reaction to the Rendition Ordinance was consistent with what I just described was the reaction and the resistance to Article 23. We often lose the plot in understanding that the Rendition Ordinance was also withdrawn after significant public pressure and public demonstrations. So that's my kind of précis of how the rule of law track has worked in very general terms. On the democratization track, we've seen nothing like the same kind of progress. Indeed, we've seen a basic law which offers a nirvana vision of what might happen after 2007. And instead, in both 2007 and 2014, we saw the National People's Congress Standing Committee render interpretations on the basic law to effectively first chill movement to fuller democratization of both the election of the chief executive and the makeup of the directly elected constituencies in the LegCo, and then in 2014, really snubbing the collective nose at the idea of democratization, certainly of the LegCo. There's a fancy two-step that we see in the chief executive, which is you've all got universal suffrage, but of course it's on a restricted list. Now, the 2014 National People's Congress Standing Committee's pronouncement or its interpretation of the Basic Law, of course, gave rise to the reaction in August of 2014, which we call the umbrella movement. And this is really important because this is not like Article 23. This is a direct popular reaction to the stymieing of democratization. Whether or not you think it was promised under the Basic Law or the Joint Declaration, either explicitly or by implication, what I want to focus on is this popular upset and outrage over the stalling on the democratization track. Now, after the umbrella movement, we come back to the latest irritant on the rule of law side, and that, of course, is the disquiet, the riots that started after the introduction of the Rendition Ordinance, which was subsequently withdrawn, as I've said. This did something unique, at least in the period that I'm looking at. It conjured up a lot of resistance, which was explicitly based upon the demands for democratization. So it was a rule of law problem, but it conjured up people who are kind of fed up with the stymieing and the blockages for democratization. So what it saw was effectively a merger of these two lines. It's kind of ironic because this rule of law outrage gave rise to demonstrations or resistance with respect to the lack of progress on democratization, which in turn gave rise to what the so-called National Security Law, which is a statute promulgated by the National People's Congress in Beijing. Now, you might accept an argument that at least on the rule of law, post-1997 looks okay. You probably wouldn't accept an argument that democratization has not proceeded well in Hong Kong after 1997. But you might think, it's within the bounds of reason, at least in terms of the authorization given in the Basic Law for those institutions. But the National Security Law is a problem of a different order. The National Security Law is a statute of the PRC, which appoints effectively an independent PRC or mainland prosecutor, where its enforcement or its prosecutions are not reviewable by the Court of Final Appeals, by the highest court in Hong Kong, which of course was the secret sauce that gave us so much happiness and comfort when we looked at the Basic Law and what I talked about as the rule of law setup that allowed the citizens of Hong Kong to have their rights, in particular their civil and political rights, protected before the courts according to the Bill of Rights and pursuant to Article 39, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is kind of sucked in a big vacuum. a vacuum move. The national security law does away with all of that so that we are now facing the prospect in Hong Kong of prosecutions, which I'm going to repeat, are not reviewable by the courts of Hong Kong, at least in terms of whether or not they conform with the basic rights guarantees offered in the basic law. So if you're looking for a real damage to the autonomy of Hong Kong, however you conceive of that, the national security law is a very, very significant hit. And as I say, it comes in the track, oh, there's my timer. It comes in the track that I've been selling to you as something which was progressing pretty well and in a pretty benign way after 1997. So I'm going to stop there, and we've gotten through the sticky stuff, and now it's going to get much more interesting, I promise.
Thank you, Professor Hausen, for sharing your insights on what these two legs, rule of law and democratization, mean in Hong Kong. Now let's move from the courts to the streets. Samson, please.
Let me first share my screen. Okay. So you can see my screen, right? Okay, so thanks very much, first of all, to Xiaohong and Dan for the invitation, also to Derek and the Weiser Center for putting together this very meaningful event. And I'm going to focus on the contentious politics side of the story. And I'll mainly, in my presentation, I'll look at three puzzles around surrounding the 2019 protests. First of all, I think we need to characterize the nature of the 2019 protests and how do we describe it. And only with that can we understand how these protests lead to the introduction of the national security law and also what is happening on the ground in Hong Kong right now. And last, I would like to think about whether the protest has really ended and what kind of legacies and traces the protests have left us with. So to begin with my talk, I want to go back to the 2019 protest first, which to me, frankly, feels like ages ago, even though it's only a year ago. And the anti-extradition bill, of course, was sparked by the proposed amendment to the city's extradition law, which would allow people to be extradited legally back to the mainland. But of course, it's also the accumulation of dissent over the years, which have led to various protests, such as the umbrella movement or the anti-national education movement much earlier. And also on the other hand, there's this development of a local identity that distinguishes from the ethnic Chinese identity. So in a way, I would say that 2019 was a sort of perfect storm for Hong Kong. We've got an unpopular law, we've got an unresponsive government, and at the same time, a disgruntled generation which they're feeling alienated both politically and economically. But in this talk, I don't intend to go into the nitty-gritty of the protests. I would just like to draw your attention to the fact that this is the largest protest in Hong Kong's history. It lasts 7 months, and one opinion poll indicated that 42% of the population actually participated at one point. So that's 3 million people. But to me, I think what distinguishes this protest is not just the numbers, but also the how it is being organized. I would like to conceptualize this protest as a leaderful activism rather than a leaderless activism, which a lot of people are using. The reason that I'm using this new conceptualization is that there are a few defining characteristics here. So first of all, there is no formal leadership, just like a lot of protests right now happening, for instance, in Thailand or in Nigeria. There are no formal leadership formed by organizations or individuals, but instead they're networked through social media and also the pre-existing civil society networks. So this has created a very decentralized structure, and it also enables the division of labor of traditional leadership tasks among the activists, among the participants, basically. For example, like raising money and framing the movement, and also, and most importantly, lobbying foreign governments, which is actually done by a lot of ordinary activists, but not the traditional leaders. So, and at the same time, we also see a very innovative and eclectic set of repertoire happening in the protests. We have this be water strategy, which means that the protest has to be fluid. We do not occupy, protesters do not occupy a particular space in Hong Kong. The repertoire is not just stick to the traditional set of sit-ins, demonstration, rallies, but instead, for instance, people use the public space and turn them into Lenin walls. There were shopping mall protests. There were also human chains. But of course, throughout the protest, we also saw radicalization. But an interesting aspect is that even though there was radicalization, the protest was to a large extent very solidaristic. So they keep the unity that help the protest to move forward. So I'll argue that it is this totalizing nature of the mobilization that on the one hand leads to the breakdown of the Hong Kong government, and also leads to this very draconian response, strong intervention from Beijing, which also drains whatever autonomy that the Hong Kong government has left over. So of course that's because from Beijing's point of view, the entire ruling coalition has failed from their perspective. The government was too weak. It didn't respond strongly to the protests, and you even have civil servants joining the protests, which is unacceptable for Beijing. You also have the entire United Front kind of failed last year because they did not respond to the protests very actively, particularly the business community. So that's why I think Beijing wants to revamp the entire ruling coalition. And of course, this year, COVID gave Beijing a lot of advantage, especially after April, after May, when the COVID situation got stabilized in the mainland. So of course, that started with the introduction of the national security law, which Nicholas has already introduced very in detail. But I think one point to add to his point is that I think the law is meant not only to impose legal restrictions, but also as a sort of blueprint for social engineering. For instance, one of the article in the national security law is to have universities and schools to promote national security education, which is kind of unprecedented to put into a legal document. Another is the implementation of the comprehensive jurisdiction. So we are seeing now an increasingly overt or salient direct rule from the liaison office. So for instance, just a few weeks ago on October 1st, we have the director of the liaison office visiting two grassroots citizens in Hong Kong and promising to improve their livelihood. So that is very reminiscent of what party secretaries in China would do during the big festivals. On the other hand, of course, we are seeing an overhaul of the city's democratic institutions, including the Legislative Council and the District Council. So we have a postponed election in Hong Kong, which will be postponed for at least a year in the name of COVID. We now have a pretty marginalized district council, which the pro-democracy camp won a landslide victory back in 2019 November. So government officials are kind of sidelining the district council. They are not attending the meetings, and there is a lot of tension. And most recently, just 2 days ago, we have the chief executive abolishing the question and answer session in the Legislative Council, which I think is a very significant development because that's a tradition introduced by Governor Chris Patten just before 1997 in the last governorship. So in order to represent that the government is represented in the Legislative Council, but that will be canceled from now on. Another, I think, alarming development is the call to reform the three mountains, the 三座大山. So that includes education, judiciary, and social service. And we are already starting to see things happening in the education sector and the judicial sector as well. So these drastic changes definitely have a drastic impact on the protests. And I think most important of which is not just in terms of the legal aspect, but also the chilling effect among the population. So if you look at this shows the average number of protests per day in Hong Kong. So of course, the height of the protest was last year around September, October. So you have average 5-6 protests a day. So of course, the red zone here is COVID, and right now, from July onwards, actually the number of protests are very, very small. And I think it's safe to say that the anti-extradition bill protests or its extension have come to an end. Of course, there are small protests like this, but that's about the size of the current protests. You have a few people, you have a lot of journalists, more than 20 journalists. Sometimes you even have just one protester. So this is a famous protester called Brother Lunch. Because he always organized this kind of lunch protests around Hong Kong. So he's a lone wolf. He just organized protests on his own. But of course, at the same time, it is important to remember to mention that we are seeing the continuation of dissent, not on the streets, but in the everyday context. So for instance, this includes political consumption. So throughout the movement, people have developed this idea of a yellow economic circle by which they boycott pro-movement businesses and they boycott pro-movement businesses and they boycott pro-Beijing companies or restaurants. I think this is very interesting because, but I don't really have time to go into this because it really shows that it seems like capitalism in Hong Kong is kind of like the last resort that people fall back into. It provides the kind of moral economy for people to sustain themselves or to continue to express their resistance. So I think it's a point that is worth to explore in the future. We have a lot of legal battles coming up, court defenses, because a lot of people who were arrested and charged will have a hearing soon, either this year or next year. And the last 2 points are very, very new to Hong Kong. We have a new diasporic activism because a lot of people are now in exile. It's the first time that Hong Kong has political exiles around the world, in the UK, in the US, in Germany. So they're actively doing international lobbying and also lobbying foreign governments to sanction Chinese and Hong Kong officials. Last but not the least, we are also seeing a trend of transnational activism, the diffusion of tactics or the active support of protests elsewhere, the Belarusian protests, and recently the Thai protests also. So we see Joshua Wong, for instance, I think 2 days ago went to the Thai embassy to raise this protest symbol in front of the embassy. I'm not going to show you the video, but I find this very intriguing because on Twitter, someone posted this is the last day of Hong Kong's History Museum because it will be closed down for 2 years. And then on the very last day, people went there and sang the protest song. When this protest song or the slogans attached to it are considered to be against the national security law. So I think it's still significant to see that the dissent in some ways are still going on. Okay. So in conclusion, I will say that the events in the past 2 years have really changed Hong Kong drastically, both for the society and for the state. I think for scholars or for political scientists, it will be good for us to really rethink the regime nature of Hong Kong. Whether it is still a hybrid regime, is it still a liberal autocratic regime, or is it moving to the authoritarian regime spectrum? But I think it's important to say that Hong Kong's democratic movement is not certified dead yet, because of all the new forms of contentious politics happening out there. And I think the grievances and dissents will pretty much still go on. So I'll stop the talk here, and I look forward to discussing with you in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan and Derek and Xiaohong and Jundai for organizing this. I'm really happy to take part in it. I don't really consider myself a Hong Kong expert. I'm an expert more on domestic China. So I'm going to talk about some issues that I think are important more broadly to understanding Chinese politics. The way I want to situate my remarks are to put Hong Kong in the context of other issues that have come up in China recently, and to make the general argument that China or the PRC is experiencing an identity crisis, and identity politics will continue to be very important to China's domestic political realm as well as its international realm. And this we see, of course, in the re-education camps in Xinjiang and the persecution of Muslim minorities. We see it in Tibet. We see it in Mongolia recently with unrest over language policies. And of course, we see it in Hong Kong. One thing that's interesting about the Chinese central government's perspective on identity, I think, is that economic development should solve all problems, and that economic development should erase problems of identity. And there's huge disappointment among people in the government and the party, but also among the domestic Chinese population, somehow that economic prosperity doesn't work and doesn't seem to solve these problems. So one question we might want to ask about Hong Kong and also these other places is, why does local identity seem to strengthen as economic development and economic prosperity takes place? And I want to just talk about 3 points, and I'll be brief. I hope I don't spend my whole time. One thing is, I think, this issue of ethnic geography and migration. And of course, what we see in all of these places, but particularly in Hong Kong and places on the borders of the PRC territory, is increasing changes in the geography and the migration of people who, of course, from Hong Kong's perspective, are mainlanders that have come into Hong Kong and changed the geography of Hong Kong, changed the nature of Hong Kong, changed the language of Hong Kong. And that process has affected Hong Kong people's own sense of identity. So it's partly about migration and changes in population that I think are important to pay attention to. A second issue is economic inequality. And this is the main issue that the central government has paid attention to in Hong Kong. But it has sort of ignored the broader context of economic inequality. Because what it is in Hong Kong, of course, is the perception of relative changes. That to be a Hong Kong native might mean that economically you may no longer keep up, right? That economically there are changes going on more broadly, whether it's real estate prices or the job market, that put you at a disadvantage. And that is playing out not just in Hong Kong and China, but it's playing out globally, right? And it's something we also see in the United States related to white identity, right? And how white identity politics have come out of this sense of grievance and also this sense of relative changes. The third issue, I think, is that the process of development itself has made, in Hong Kong and other places in China, people care more about what we call non-materialistic values, which include issues of identity, issues of self-expression, and issues of political participation. And that's another reason why economic development and economic prosperity doesn't solve the problem of identity. It makes the problem more pointed. It makes the problem more politicized. And we see that playing out in Hong Kong. We see it playing out in other places around China. So China is facing an identity crisis. It's a crisis of political identity. Broadly speaking, around the world, where many people may identify as ethnically Chinese, all Chinese people have nested identity, whether it's a local identity that's part of the broader PRC identity, whether it's being Hong Kong Chinese as well as being a member of the PRC, whether it's being an overseas Chinese and also a member of another country. All Chinese people have nested identities. And what you see disturbingly in Hong Kong, and you see it, of course, even more pointedly in Taiwan, is the divergence of a local identity and an identity that is part of a political entity that we might call China, however you want to define what China is. And that is what the PRC government now faces. It faces something slightly different in Xinjiang because Xinjiang is part of China and has been part of China since the beginning of the PRC or just shortly after. But in Hong Kong, I think it's a particularly troubling divergence. And that divergence is something that has occurred over the process of 1997 and the legal and political changes that have happened, along with the economic changes that I'm talking about. So I'm not saying that it's all about the economy, because that's not what I think, but it's part of this process. And so what I just want to point out in regards to how China has currently solved the problem of Hong Kong identity, which is through subjugation, outright subjugation through the national security law. That means that solving the problem of Hong Kong through force now means that solving the problem of Taiwan without force is increasingly impossible. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Yuan, for sharing with us your observation, thoughts, and contentious politics in Hong Kong. And thank you, Professor Gallagher, for setting our discussion today on Hong Kong against a broader national political context in China. Finally, we will now turn to the social and cultural aspects of Hong Kong and contemporary China. Xiaohong, please.
Thank you, Junda, and thanks for everyone who's Zooming now. So I'm going to talk about the larger kind of cultural or social context of this, the relationship between mainland China and Hong Kong. More particularly looking at the relationship between two sides and how they kind of understand politicization and depoliticization. Now, one of the things that people notice during this protest is how successful the Chinese government is in terms of describing the movement on Chinese social media. But oftentimes the discursive logic of that success has not been well understood. The one message is that, that Hong Kong youth have been so irrationally politicized today as to jeopardize the economic fortune of the city. Another concludes that Hong Kong protesters are rubbish youth, Fei Qing, who are demanding democracy simply because they are losers in a meritocratic system who cannot afford to buy a flat. More sophisticated Chinese propagandists quickly attribute this crisis to the failure of quote-unquote neoliberalism. But they ridicule the Hong Kong protesters for not daring to wage a class war against the business tycoons, but being fixed on what they call empty slogans of democracy and freedom. Now, common to all three discourses is their reduction of politics to economics. Now, as many scholars have pointed out, and Mary also mentioned, that this reduction of politics to economics is the usual tactics that the Chinese state deployed in face of protests on the mainland too, right? Democratic or contentious demands are usually framed as disruptive of economic developments, and when necessary are bought off with money. Now, what's also noticeable is the deep-seated analogy with Chinese Cultural Revolution that is being invoked here. So the Chinese social media was flooded with reference to the Hong Kong protesters as yellow guards or black guards, a twist of red guards during the Cultural Revolution, whose political irrationality has allegedly already been overcome by the economic and market rationality of China's elites and new middle class. So I'll show you some data, Weibo data, right? So the yellow guards, as you can see, this wordplay really come off in this 2019, right? It could have coincide with the protest wave. Some, of course, call Hong Kong protesters blackguards because they don't know the political lexicons of Hong Kong. So they kind of just refer them to as blackguards because they wear black. And you can also see that it coincides with the Hong Kong protests until 2020, when it's reverting mainly in the summer to the Black Lives Matter in the US. But anyway, the analogy is very clear that they are built on this notion that these social movement participants, protesters are sort of certain new version of red guards. And that, of course, came much earlier in when they refer to the Sunflower movement in Taiwan. I'm going to show you that as well. So in that Green Guards, that vocabulary really pick up around Sunflower movement. And then later on, during the formation of New Power Party, 时代力量, which was built on the Sunflower movement. And then you see in 2018, when there was the election, midterm election, and then this year, it seems that it's going out because the reason of the election, partly because I think that there's a loss of interest in Taiwanese politics. But what is interesting, I want to also point out is that the time, the year 2014, when this word Green Guards were coined by Chinese netizens because of the Sunflower movement, the Yellow Guard didn't appear, even though the color yellow really came in that year during the Occupy Central or Umbrella movement. And I think that's it really tell you something, because that year there's a certain silence, like there's a aporia, certain kind of loss of language, how to respond, how to describe what's going on in Hong Kong, as opposed to Taiwan, where there's a certain narrative already being prepared by then. So what is less known, right? This so anyway, it's very clear that this is a sort of a certain understanding of Hong Kong politics as being too politicized, and that the sort of depoliticized kind of discourse in the mainland have a hard time understanding this. Now, what's less noticeable is that there's a history of that between Hong Kong and the mainland on sort of depolarization, and that is partly built on this understanding that I mean, sort of when in the 1970s, when China is moving away from the Cultural Revolution, and sort of Hong Kong emerged really as a model of depoliticization, and so the image of Hong Kong being this kind of economic driven, like not being swayed by political irrationalism as in on the mainland is a part of attraction there, and so you can see that convergence at the time, and even that convergence in terms of narrative of the Cultural Revolution as this kind of political dark age. So Hong Kong's Cultural Revolution in 1967 was also deeply kind of shaping a lot of political understanding in Hong Kong, but in a way being framed very similarly on the mainland in post-Mao era. So it's really because of this that there's certain kind of frustration on the mainland in terms of understanding what's going on in Hong Kong and the kind of politicization they see, and there's a sense of betrayal there, as of that we are kind of emulating you in the last 20 years of bidding farewell to politics, and now you are betraying us, you're disrupting the business, disrupting sort of economic development. So that kind of confusion is very visible when people kind of think about on the mainland that discourse. And that depolarization is being now weaponized by Beijing, right, to counter, because Beijing has, of course, has an agenda of building up this us and them kind of struggle over control. And so the middle class kind of depolarization is now being weaponized for that purpose. And I think that reason why it can be weaponized, on the one hand, it has to do with Cultural Revolution, as I mentioned, but it's more something deeper. And that there are two, I think at least two fissures that you can see from the cultural politics on both sides. And one fissure is about effective politics, and the other is sort of the Hong Kong identity, the ambiguity of, and I will mention, I will touch upon both in each. Now, I will summarize this two sides as more like this, instead of one country, two systems, I would say one cultural revolution, two tenements. And the reason is that you see a lot of convergence of the understanding of cultural revolution on both sides as of this negative common ground for depolarization. Even though they would have slight different understanding of historical personalities and events, but generally speaking, that's a shared consensus on both sides. But when it comes to Tiananmen, it's slightly different. And that's a higher level of disagreement, more relevant to intellectuals and elites. So even for liberal intellectuals on the mainland, it's something that they will find hard time to understand the Hong Kong contentious politics. And that's the reason, I think, the reason I call it two Tiananmen is because the Tiananmen in Beijing was in the post-Tiananmen era as understood as a story of regret, right? Is we made mistakes and let's move on. Let's think away because the sort of reflection, quote unquote, was that, that it seems that China was not ready for democracy, were totally irrational. The Chinese people, they are therefore need to be, their political irrationality. So the reason why it happened, that tragedy and in tragedy, in other words, is not because the crackdown, it's because we did something wrong. We don't know how to negotiate. To some extent, that's what's true, right? But what's interesting is how the kind of conclusion that come out of that, which is that, we need to have market rationality to discipline, to tame political irrationality. And therefore, we move from passion to interest, right? And so that's, if you put in Albert Hirschman's vocabulary. And so, whereas in Hong Kong, the Tiananmen in Hong Kong was a moment of political awakening, right? And that sort of was, in a way, a divergence, a divergent path that leads to a very different kind of political culture, which is very sustained, kind of effective solidarity. And I think that's the interesting contrast between these two sides, because even the for example, some of the very well-educated liberal intellectuals wouldn't understand, for example, at least would be frustrated how irrational, quote unquote, the effective aspects of Hong Kong movements, like these creative kind of emotional sides, are often discredited, saying these would ruin, the movement in the name of political prudence, right? And so that disconnect, this rejection of effective or emotional aspect of politics is so deep-seated on the mainland that it's even harder, even hard for somebody like typical intellectuals would be more sympathetic to the protest, to grasp what's going on in Hong Kong. And I think that tells a lot about China rather than or mainland China than what's going on in Hong Kong, right? And the other aspect of this I felt is that this question of Hong Kong identity, right? Now, so a lot of mainlanders, intellectuals would be, sometimes would had hard time, for example, understand some of the most visible kind of activists. They were not even born in Hong Kong, right? But somehow they would ridicule them for being, they were not even real Hong Kongers, and they kind of claim that identity. And the reason was because this identity as politics that Professor Gallagher just mentioned has two sides. The Hong Kongers can be understood as, typically, whether it's ethnic or civic, right? That on the one side, you can read it as ethnic, and that's something you born into. It's ascriptive, or it's something that you earn, you sort of obtain through political engagement. And so that's a difference, although I think that difference is sometimes, kind of can be ambivalent, because I think those two sides both kind of appeared in Hong Kong movement. Some articulation like Brian Leong have a very clear kind of civic identity, right? That it's about Hong Kong kind of having this shared compassion, and whereas you could have that ethnic side as well. I think what sociologist Rogers Baker sort of make that distinction. He was saying that this distinction, this civic versus ethnic nationalism, is being very problematic because it's partly a distinction that can be weaponized by nationalism themselves, right? They want to claim that, nobody want to claim to be ethnic nationalism, but they want to claim the civic nationalism to kind of appear to be more inclusive. I think what's more crucial, his suggestion would be whether it's about state frame nationalism versus counter state nationalism. But in both cases, I think the difference come down to whether there's a certain what I call the society as a practical ontology, and I think that depolarization discourse or hegemony on the mainland seem to be like this. There's a sort of this society as a disappearing kind of category. Now you could have families, you could have individuals, you could have organizations, you could have markets, you could have states, but society as a practical kind of category that we can like the individual citizen can engage is something that's being missing. And I think that's really one of the fundamental fissures in this divide as well. Yeah, so I will stop there and look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Now we have about 35 minutes for questions. You can raise questions at any time in the Q&A section. If you want to raise questions but want to remain anonymous, please make a note when you put your question in that section, and I will not read out your name. But now, since the rules is newly announced, let's start with our director's question from Dan Slater. This is more, I think this is a question in general set against what Mary talked about in her presentation about economic development and identity politics, but it's a general question for all our panelists. Dan made the note that the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, historically identifies with mainland people, not only because of economic performance, but also because of the revolution. But that carries no weight in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Tibet, in Xinjiang. So let's see. If there is anything that the CCP can do in Hong Kong, or it's just historically and structurally impossible to make that. So maybe we will start, let's see.
can say something since I raised the issue.
Mhm.
I mean, I'd love to hear what other people think. I mean, everyone has talked about identity to one degree or more, but I think that is partly why when the central government has vocalized its views of these issues, it has put so much emphasis on economic development and economic prosperity. Even more so, I think, for Xinjiang and some of the other border regions, but also for Taiwan and Hong Kong. Sorry, for Hong Kong, not Taiwan. And including this, the notion of the solution to the Hong Kong problem is this idea of pan-integration, right? The Pearl River Delta pan-integration, which is the absorption of Hong Kong into the Pearl River Delta region. And that, in some ways they may think is solving the identity issue because that identity is a Cantonese identity or something like that. But it doesn't solve this other issue that Xiaohong is talking about, which is that Hong Kong identity is not only an ethnic identity, but it also has a civic component to it. And increasingly, I think when you see this divergence in measurement of Hong Kong identity, divergence in I feel like I'm a Hong Konger and I don't feel like I'm Chinese or I don't identify as Chinese, it's that civic identity becoming stronger and the ethnic identity becoming less strong. That's simplifying, I think, a more complicated issue, though.
Can I say something?
Please.
Can you hear me? It's a very interesting question. And I might just note that a lot of people inside the PRC in the so-called mainland, whether intellectuals or sort of commercial people, I think thought or hoped that people in Hong Kong might identify with a different revolution, not 1949, but the 1911 revolution. Because after all, Hong Kong was split away from the motherland pursuant to the Treaty of Nanjing, and represents this terrible mark in Chinese history. So certainly a lot of people that I know and deal with in the PRC, I think even before 1997, thought, boy, those people in Hong Kong are going to be so glad to come back to China. Not communist China, not the PRC, but back to China. And that's one of the tragedies of what we're seeing now, which is that's proven to be almost completely false.
Zhang, you want to respond, or you want to?
Maybe I can just shortly respond to Dan's question. I think it's a really good question. And I think Beijing actually realized that they cannot turn back the clock and make Hong Kong people understand the 1949 revolution. So instead, like Nicholas said, they're turning towards nationalism. And I think not only the 1911 revolution, but they're also treating 1997 itself as a revolution, as the point of Huigui, returning to the motherland, and of course the implementation of national security law as the second handover. And in Hong Kong, I think we're seeing a rather schizophrenic society. On the one hand, a lot of younger generation development of this civic identity, but I think it's important to recognize there's a portion of population that held on to this greater Chinese ethnic identity, especially people whom I also research in native place association, Tongxianghui, and they're really strong on, they're now organizing protests in front of the U.S. consulate, and I think these are what is happening after 1997 to re-strengthen the kind of ethnic linkage with the mainland and also with their native places.
I agree. I mean, I think that's this is a great question. I don't think I have a perfect answer to this, but I felt partly it's just there's a game like Beijing sort of felt like they can do with non-political, political economic resources to at least sort of have the foundation. I mean, the idea is always like, get a foundation, now we have politics there. Or whether we should engage politics in the first place. And so far, their strategy is always, we try to have the material foundation. And so, you pour resources, money, clientelism. But whether that would, work would depend a lot on they have a certain kind of political economy of managing this machine in itself. I mean, it's costly to spend all this money on these. So whether it's at some point they would need to have a second thought, and that would be a big kind of bigger political question. Yeah.
And we have a question from our own student, Ziyi Wu, Mary, your student. Thanks for the presentations. His question is, how do you view the claim made by the CCP and some citizens in China that it has already granted enough rights to residents in Hong Kong, especially on voting rights? Also, the voting rights now granted to Hong Kong is much larger than what Hong Kong had as a British colony, and the quote unquote true general election has never been enacted. Thus, it's unreasonable for Hong Kong to seek for such rights, especially with foreign help. Do you think this kind of propaganda is effective in generating public support in mainland? If so, what's the cost and benefit of this kind of propaganda overseas? Thank you.
Maybe I can take this question. I think it's a really, really good question because it has never really been properly addressed, even in the local society. A proper answer to this. I think this kind of view is very powerful in the mainland, but the problem is that it's one-sided. Because actually the pro-democracy movement, if you look into it, it actually happened way earlier than 1997. So it happened in Hong Kong since the early 1980s. There has been a movement pushing for democratization, and the British was kind of softly responding to it. So softly opening the political representation. And I think it's important to mention that the handover deal was actually, the promise was to grant greater democracy to Hong Kong. And at that time, it's called a democratic reunification. And it's a deal that is struck, kind of tacit consent between the local society and Beijing that, after the handover, there will be greater democracy. So I think these kind of claims need to, take these historical facts into context. And I think part of why it was so powerful is because for a very long time in the colonial rule, actually only the last 10 years or so have been more democratic. and that's why it's so powerful, and because it's partially right. And I think internationally, this is a huge embarrassment to Britain, actually, because of the fact that it actually couldn't secure Beijing to stick to its promise to introduce greater democracy. And also it also begs the question, why didn't Britain introduce democracy in Hong Kong much earlier? I think this is a point that the diasporic activism might be pursuing. Pushing the British to stand up to its responsibility.
I want to just add, very short comment. I mean, that view is this claim is purely based on this kind of Huaxia, worldview where we grant, something a lesser sort of partner certain quote unquote rights. But if you look at, like from more Hong Kong or international kind of perspective, Hong Kong's democratization aspiration really parallel to, Korea or Taiwan, because that's their sort of peers when it comes to economic development, and also that aspiration in the 80s and 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so that comparison shouldn't be lost when we discuss this this question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I agree with the other panelists. There's no doubt that this is an extremely effective and powerful statement inside the PRC, where, as we all admit, there is tremendous resentment, sometimes verging on sort of ethnic hostility towards the people of Hong Kong and the deal they've had and the, you know, their material standard of living, et cetera, et cetera. But that's why 2014 is so important for me, at least as an observer, because if you look at what happened in 2003 and the resistance to Article 23, that could still be cabined in some minds as, well, the problem is the legislation is too vague. There are no due process rights in it. That's why people are in the streets. And that's estimable and wonderful, but that's not democracy. In August of 2014, it's clear that the people of Hong Kong, a lot of people of Hong Kong, are in the streets about democratization. And that's why we have to keep going back, I think, to the umbrella movement as a real departure in the last 30 years.
I want to just mention one thing that I think is a theory that I don't have any evidence for, really, but I will state it because I think it is somewhat linked to what we see with democratization globally, is this question of diffusion. And I do think that it's related to this question in the sense that one possible reason for the central government to be so unwilling to grant Hong Kong the autonomy it may have been given or promised in the Basic Law is that it sets a precedent for the rest of the mainland. And there's lots of places in the mainland where people have asked for more rights to participate in politics, more rights to expression. And I think, you know, particularly in places like Shanghai, Shanghainese do not think that they are inferior to Hong Kongers. So why should Hong Kongers have more rights than Shanghaiese? So to kind of flip the question around, I think one way to think about it is, would granting Hong Kong rights of autonomy, of democracy, of rule of law, create demand within the rest of the mainland for those same rights?
Thank you. Let's turn to several questions about the contentious politics in Hong Kong. Let's start with An Ling's question. It seems to me that one of the difficulties of leaderful activism is that it's hard to create a set of proposals to negotiate with. The 5 demands, not one less slogan was impossible to negotiate with by definition. Leaders who can speak for their followers are necessary to ensure that deals will be respected once made. Is it possible to go from decentralized leadership to incremental political negotiation?
So let me take this respond to this question shortly. I think this is a great question because this is a central dilemma in contentious politics. When you have a decentralized structure, it's hard to negotiate with the government. I actually generally agree. It's difficult. It's almost impossible to have incremental political negotiation when you have such a decentralized and leaderful structure. And we actually already see the same phenomenon in 2014. When there was a leadership in the umbrella movement, but at the same time, there was a mass out there occupying the streets. So you see numerous negotiations between the leaders and the government. They were being torpedoed by people who were outside. They're being, you know, the whole entire process kind of failed because they were not agreed. Those negotiations were not agreed up by the mass, okay? And so 2020 is basically a continuation and moving towards the leaderless or leaderful direction. And I think it's unavoidable. It's not something that is easily fixable. And I don't think anyone, even in the movement, have a solution for it. Because whenever, for instance, Joshua Wong, who is recognized as one of the leaders, when he's hand over a mic, when someone interviewed him, the first thing he will say that is, I'm not the leader, I'm not representing the movement. I'm an activist only. So in that kind of scenario, the government won't have anyone to talk to. So instead, they're just talking to everyone. And there's no such thing as an incremental political negotiation. And of course, it's also strengthened by the impact of social media. Because whenever there's a discussion, the social media will talk about it, and suddenly, you know, discussion in the LIHKG forum in Hong Kong, it's like Reddit, will, you know, push it to a different direction. So it's unavoidable, and I don't think anyone has a solution for this. And it's also happening in I think in Thailand or in Belarus, elsewhere as well.
Okay. To follow up on that, it's both for Samsung and for the entire panel.
Right.
Regarding the new forms of contentious politics, do you think the current forms of protest, for example, more through online, seeking transnational solidarity, such as milk tea alliances, etc., are due to the result of increasing or perceived political risks? For example, the passage of the national security law, or because protesters also found better and more efficient ways to voice out the claims and to accumulate energies for the next wave?
Yeah, thanks for this question from my colleague in Baptist. I think it's, I think of course the support for the Thai protests or Belarusian protests is a much safer avenue to do when we have the national security law and it's a safer way to express a dissent. But I think the real reason here why there's so much support in Hong Kong, because traditionally Hong Kongers don't really look outside for other protests. They're very local. But now a lot of people are going on Twitter and supporting the Thai protests, the Belarusian protests, places that, Belarus, no one very few people in Hong Kong have been there. So, but I think it's important that it expresses the transnational and the cosmopolitan element that was that defines the 2019 protests, because a lot of support came in from abroad during that time. A lot of Thai activists, for instance, support the Hong Kong protests, and so now I think they see the activists see it as like a moral obligation to pay back to those activists who are supporting. So this milk tea alliance is something really new in Asia, because traditionally Asia doesn't have, the concept of Asia is very vague. Even in Asia, we don't really see, unlike in Europe or unlike in America. But right now, people are really talking about what's happening in Thailand and in Indonesia and to some extent in Japan. In Japan, we're seeing a lot of Japanese actually supporting the Hong Kong protests. So it's entirely new landscape that we are entering into 2020. And it seems that there is this Asian, I don't know whether it's right to call it Asian Spring, because there's only Hong Kong and Thailand. Indonesia actually had a protest last year as well. But this Asian resistance is kind of formulating. That's what I see.
Mm-hmm. I can wait in just to maybe combine these two, just a short comment. I think there's a trend of, so this question of sort of leader for movement having no institutionalized kind of structure for the government to negotiate. I think that's a good question, but in a way it also reflects the other side, because the weakness of this is social movement typically we call this kind of radical flank question, right? Whether the moderates have certain kind of leverage with radicals, and I think that reason why the movement kind of going this direction is because also across Asia, I think the other side, the establishment politics now also, the moderates are losing out to the radical, to the kind of more authoritarian kind of force in that in the establishment, and it's hard for if you have for the both sides of the moderates to now to talk that may happen in the past. So you see that kind of putting away and that radicalization on the street reflect that radicalization in establishment politics as well.
Okay, this is from Professor Duffy of UM, now living in Singapore. What about the less pleasant aspects of the protests, where a small but violent element provided by the PRC propaganda, a justification for the securities laws? Why was there no apparent attempt to rein in these destructive elements who hurt the just and valid cause?
Again, I would just say this is partly, whether what kind of context would you sort of place to. I think the reason why sort of radicalization is quote unquote issue has a lot to do with this losing ground of the moderates within the establishment, which leads to the moderates in the Democratic camp losing their leverage. I think that's so it can sort of get fixed on one side without looking at the other side.
So on the question about radicalization, it's indeed a great concern in Hong Kong in 2019, and of course, I think to the outside it seems that the protest is very radical, it's very violent. People, setting fires everywhere, even in the subway station. But from the view of Hong Kong, we're also seeing that it's actually a kind of constrained radicalization. So whenever things kind of go out of the boundary or go too far, it will be kind of constrained back by the movement, by the moderate elements. And it's very interesting. It's not being done by a leading organization. Unlike in the past, you have a social movement organization kind of rein in the radical elements. But here it's more done by a kind of a solidarity. It's a solidarity mechanism between the moderates and the radicals. So there is a tacit consent in Hong Kong that solidarity is the most important thing. So for the moderate elements, you can give people a pat on the shoulder to say that, oh, you're doing too much, don't do that. But it's nice words. You're not going to reprimand them or condemn them in an open platform. So that was the consensus last year. And that's why I think to the outside world, we're not seeing how the movement trying to sever ties with the radical elements, but instead kind of rein them in and to maintain solidarity. And I think there's a lesson learned in the umbrella movement, because what happened in the umbrella movement was that very quickly you see a split between the radicals and the moderates. And it's partly that this split is exacerbated by the spatial dynamics, because there are different occupied zones. So Mong Kok, if you've been to Hong Kong, Mong Kok was the radical zone and Admiralty was the moderate zone. So, but in 2019, that wasn't the case, because it's be water, it's everywhere. So everything was happening online. So this kind of ethics was developed online to kind of rein in the radical elements. And that's why I think it's important to add in how constrained this radicalization also was.
I just want to emphasize how important, as I think the questioner has it right, the violence that occurred in 2019 is from a number of viewpoints. And I don't mean just the storming of LegCo, but some of the other violence that people saw in Hong Kong. Obviously that helped the Central People's Government in terms of their propaganda approach, their justification for what became the national security law. I think it also helped, let's call them reactionary actors in another part of this world that we have not talked about tonight, which is members of the Hong Kong elite, or what goes for the Hong Kong government. There are forces inside the Hong Kong government, and I'm thinking of, well, I won't name any names, but who are profoundly reactionary. And of course, they're interested in maintaining their own power and benefits. In some ways, they're more reactionary or more against democratization or local autonomy than some of the more informed opinion in the center. So the violence, aided them in their understanding and their portrayal of what was happening in Hong Kong. It also, kind of in a reverberation effect, allowed people in Beijing, those hardliners, to say, look, the Hong Kong government can't handle this. It's gotten out of control. So all of these things, triggered by the violence, supported something which I think everyone regrets. And to me, it's another one of the tragedies of 2019, in particular, the storming of LegCo.
I want to add something to that as well, which is something about the role of social scientists in studying the Hong Kong movement. Because I read this morning in the Washington Post a new study that attempts to examine the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States in the summer of 2020 and much more accurately measure how violent those protests were, because of course what you see in the United States and what you see also in China is the comeback or the response to civil unrest is law and order, right? The need to crack down and the need to use violence, and we've seen that in the United States as well. And what they showed, of course, in the case of the United States, is that those protests were overwhelmingly peaceful. They weren't completely peaceful, but they were overwhelmingly peaceful. And I think that in the Hong Kong case, obviously you have very, very high profile cases of violence, like you see in the Legco incident, which I think is unfortunate. And I think probably even the radical protesters themselves probably now have come to regret. But I think that needs to be put in the whole context of the movement, and the whole context of the movement, like Samson is talking about, 7 months of mobilization, maybe 3 million participants. I think if we could do that kind of analysis in Hong Kong, you would find similar findings, that overwhelmingly there was the maintenance of peaceful protest.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is the sort of context of information diffusion. So, for example, almost in each sort of radical wave in the movement, right, almost followed by some spontaneous gestures from the radicals to apologize to the moderates. And these are so important for them to cement this kind of solidarity with the moderates to keep their support. But oftentimes that aspect being lost in when it comes to international media, because they tend to focus on the kind of sensational images of violence. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll combine 3 questions and ask them together, because there's an interesting connection among these 3 questions. What is a Chinese identity? And what is Xi's definition of Chinese identity? Second, why does it seem that Hong Kong localism only become more recent? It's a more recent phenomenon. Opinion polls show that Hong Kongers' sense of identity have been shifting away from Chinese to Hong Konger. And this is especially true for the post-handover generation. Why do you think Hong Kong localist identity is developing under PRC administration, but not so much during the British colonial administration? And third question, during the Tiananmen, there was a lot of supports from Hong Kong and Taiwan, but not many support from mainlanders for Hong Kong this time. Why?
So I can pitch. I mean, I think my whole point is that there's this great divide in sort of political culture on both sides, and it's also this particular moment because Hong Kong youth. I mean, the fundamental difference is that whether politics, the political, should be indispensable in our life. Right, and I think that's something that the mainlanders don't understand. Sort of the most hegemonic discourse doesn't accommodate. There's, I mean, this reduction of politics to economics is so insidious that there is a sort of misconception of politics in Taiwan, so also in Hong Kong. So, for example, right, they would say that this is a neoliberalism. So why do you talk about income inequality? Why talk about democracy? Right, as if these are two mutually exclusive agendas. And I think that the reason why the young people in Hong Kong are holding on to that political aspect essential, and that speaks to so that primacy of politics as a realm of freedom of agency. I think that's something is being often lost in mainland discourse, and that speaks also to the Chinese identity. I think the question is whether the Chinese identity is simply something like you're born into and you cannot change, or whether there's something that you can recreate, right? If Chinese identity is something you can never like touch, you can never do anything about it. And it's only something that once you're born into, you are condemned into. And I think that would be a sad kind of phenomenon, but that's also in a way how the mainstream Chinese nationalist discourse propped by Beijing try to phrase this, like, or protesting in Hong Kong, Taiwan, you're already Chinese, don't deny you're Chinese, right? And I think that doesn't sell well if you want to have certain kind of agency about your identity in this age. If it's if there's no, I mean, unless you only frame that as a yeah, so that kind of whether that gives you certain agency is, I think, the crucial part.
So sorry, Samson, just one very quick and partial response, of course, is that until quite recently, let's say a decade or more, there weren't a lot of people from the PRC, from mainland China, in Hong Kong. So when I first lived and worked in Hong Kong in the early 80s, there was no question that the people there had anything whatsoever to do with the People's Republic of China and had anything whatsoever to do with speaking Mandarin, right? It was only after 1983-84 where people understood what Deng Xiaoping had said to Maggie Thatcher. You had the Basic Law, then finally the handover, when Hong Kong suddenly becomes filled with PRC citizens, PRC origin Chinese, and of course lots of companies and government departments, et cetera, et cetera. So of course the natural result is significant tension in the minds of people who perceive themselves as locals of something, but not what those new people are.
Actually, I think that in Hong Kong, interestingly, there are two kinds of Chinese identity. Okay, so there's the kind of identity that Xiaohong just talked about, a kind of primordial identity that you can't change once you're in it. Okay, it's by blood. Another Chinese identity, which actually I do believe a lot of Hong Kong people share, is this kind of cultural Chinese identity. So everyone in Hong Kong, when we're young, we read Jin Yong's 小说, Jin Yong, so the martial art novels. A Hong Kong writer, but writing about historical novels about China, and everyone read it. It's the most borrowed book in the library, or the set of books in the library. So everybody kind of loves the traditional Chinese culture in a way, and we watch the TV dramas. And I would say that this kind of trend is all the way, even until now, people are still reading Jin Yong. I don't think people are repellent of traditional Chinese culture. It's important to say people still feel that they're kind of culturally Chinese, but I think the shift happens, for a very long time, Hong Kong people actually develop kind of dual identity. We feel Hong Konger, but at the same time, we're not repellent of Chinese identity. And this, the growth of the localist, or the growth of Hong Kong identity, actually began long before 1997. It was from the 1970s when we start to have television at our home, and people watch TV and kind of distinguish themselves from mainland Chinese and feel that they're from Hong Kong. But I think the real shift was after the 2008 Beijing Olympics. And you also see the same shift in Taiwan as well. It was the cutoff point when the dual identities start to fade away. People feeling more local, but they don't feel that they're ethnically Chinese. And I think that there's this divergence between the cultural and the political identity of Chinese identity. And I think this is what we're feeling at the moment. I don't think people deny that they're culturally Chinese, but they don't feel themselves as politically Chinese.
So I guess, do I get the last word, Jindai? Can I say something? I know we're over time. I just wanted to answer the question about why is the local identity now increasing in Hong Kong, but it wasn't increasing under the British colonial administration. I actually don't know if it was or not increasing, but what I would say is that if we think about political identity is always contextual, and it's in that period of time, being a Hong Kong Chinese or being a Hong Konger, it still meant you were part of the British imperial entity, and so it didn't really help you or serve you politically. Much more important to talk about the fact that you are not British, right? That you're anti-colonial. And I think that is what happened more during the British regime. And, you know, political identity is about things like redistribution. It's about equality. It's about political expression. And those are the reasons why we see political identity in Hong Kong now diverging from Chinese identity. And I think that, you know, culture itself can or cannot help political identity. And I would say to Samson, of course, when I read Shakespeare, I don't feel any more British.
Okay, thank you all for attending today's Flashpoint panel on Hong Kong, organized by WCD and co-sponsored by LRCCS. WCD has an incoming panel on presidentialism at 4 p.m. on Tuesday, November 10th. Thank you all, our panelists, for sharing with us your research, your thoughts, your observations. I hope you all have learned a lot from today's panel, as I have. Good night and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.